Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Mary Catherine Duffy. Welcome to everyone to this SAES webinar. I am the Director of Professional Development for SAES, and we have Rob Devlin, our Executive Director here. And we're going to be talking today about supporting and evaluating the head of school. And this is such an important topic, Rob. And so we're glad everyone's here. And we're going to ask you to involve yourself in this Zoom call via the chat. And so I'm sure that Rob's going to want to know a little bit about where everybody's from. And so if you have a minute as we're beginning this to put your name and your role at the school and what school you are representing in the chat, we would appreciate that. We are recording this webinar, so there will be people watching us that are not live. And so we want to welcome you as well. Rob, I want to turn it over to you to get the conversation started.
I appreciate that. And before we get started, just a quick reminder and disclaimer for everybody. We're going to cover some important information from you guys, but as always, any of our information that we provide here at SAES should not be construed as legal advice. We're not attorneys. We're folks that help unify and support and encourage Episcopal schools across 6 different states. So, if it's a legal matter, always consult your counsel. But we're going to talk about a very important topic today. And in the industry out there, we're seeing unprecedented amounts of transition in school leadership and schools across the board. They're looking for new heads. There's leadership transitions. There's people that are retiring or leaving the business altogether. And so this is a very timely topic for us to talk about. How can we retain our leaders through excellent support and evaluation? And it's one of the most critical things as board members that we can do. I know we have some board members, we have some members of the clergy, we've got some sitting heads of school on this particular call. And so for all of us, this is going to be really important information because research shows that the more stability that we can have in the leadership role of our school, the better off in the long term our schools are, the healthier they are if we can create that sense of stability. And one important factor in creating that stability is setting up the right framework for supporting and evaluating the head of school as the chief executive of the organization. So should we go ahead and jump right into the presentation, Mary Catherine?
Absolutely.
All right, I'm going to share a screen with you guys here. Can you guys see that?
No, not yet.
Hold on a sec.
There we go. Yep.
There we go. Thank you.
All right, so we are good to go. Let me shorten this up here so I can see some more real estate on my screen. All right, supporting and evaluating the head of school. These two things, it's important, I think, Mary Catherine, sometimes, maybe in your experience, you've seen this as well. Schools get the supporting piece, but not so much the evaluating piece. Other schools are really good at the evaluating piece, but not so much the support piece. And some schools, are really missing an opportunity on both of these counts of supporting and evaluating. Mary Catherine, has that been consistent with your experience with all the schools that you go out to visit?
Yeah, I think if you're looking at the two, people tend to find it easier to support the head of school than they do to evaluate. And I don't know why that is as much, unless it's just that generally evaluation is a little bit of a gray topic in the school industry. The way teachers are evaluated, the way everybody's evaluated in education is very different from the corporate world. And so I think we tend to shy a little bit away from evaluating. The other thing that I think is a challenge, especially in smaller schools, is that evaluation is not well understood. And so consequently, in smaller schools where everyone knows everyone and the head of school is maybe the gift of being a head of school where you know everyone and you maybe come from the community, it can become a challenge. Then people don't really want to evaluate their friends or people that they've known a long time. I had one time a guy that was a board chair, and he was a full 10, 15 years younger than me. And he did not want to evaluate me because he just didn't feel like that he had the ability to do that. And I said, no, you have to do that. It's so important. And it's important for me as a head of school. I want to grow. I want to know what I need to do better, what areas I need to improve. And if you don't do that, you're not helping me and you're not supporting me. So I think evaluating the head of school, there's a portion of that is actually supporting. Does that make
100%.
sense?
Yeah, if we treat the evaluation process as a tool and enter it as a way of thinking about ways to help our chief executive improve and get better, that evaluation piece can very effectively be part of that support piece as well.
Correct.
I'm glad that you mentioned that, Mary Catherine. Listen, a lot of you guys, some of you guys may be fairly new in your tenure as heads of school, or maybe the head that you're supporting and evaluating is new to your environment. And so it's really critical to set the stage on this as early as you can, right? Now, some of you may have been, around for a little while, and it's a little more difficult to create a new structure. But wherever you are in the process, whether you've got, a new head of school coming, or you're a new head of school this year, or you anticipate a change in the near future, I would highly recommend that you jump right in and begin right off the bat with a clear set of expectations around being very intentionally supportive, but also having evaluation expectations. And we're going to cover some best practices for that for us today, right? So again, we're going to talk about evaluating, and we're talking about supporting the head of school. So probably important to think about why we need to evaluate to begin with. And so if we look at some of the literature out there, and this actually comes from the National Association of Episcopal Schools Bulletin on Best Practices for Schools, the purpose of evaluation is to improve the institution by allowing or providing opportunities for the head of school to grow and develop. That is super, super important. And you can see how the evaluation piece and the support piece are tied together because of this one particular statement. The review of the head's performance and his professional, in the context of professional goals, I think is something that can guide the school, keep the board appropriately engaged in the strategic thinking that they need to be doing, but then also identifies ways that they can continue to support the head in their growth as a leader. And so super important that we do these evaluation pieces. And again, Mary Catherine, I'm glad that you mentioned that anecdote where your board chair was hesitant to want to evaluate you. And I think especially in schools, I don't know why it is in schools that this is more common, that it's a little more touchy-feely. We don't want to offend anyone. We don't want anyone to be upset.
I think it's the culture. I honestly think a lot of it is the culture of, especially in a preschool, our preschools, our culture of preschools and preschool elementary schools, it's children and nurturing and kindness, and that feels to some extent the opposite of, hey, we're going to sit you down and tell you what you need to do to improve. And yet in our schools, what we're doing every day in classrooms is saying, okay, kids, this is what we're going to learn, and here are the areas that you need to improve on, right? We're saying that to our students. We're modeling that in our classrooms, but we struggle in leadership to do it. And so I think a little bit of it is the cultural norm of a school. Maybe it's not as hard in high school. I don't know. But it feels harder in these where we're dealing with younger children and people who deal with younger children. That makes sense.
Yeah, and those of you coming from the corporate environment, I've worked in both in schools and in corporate environments. And, typically my experience in corporate environments is there's much less hesitation and very clear and direct expectations, real intentionality around the evaluation process. And you're aware of what that's going to come. And it's for whatever reason, is often not taken quite as personally. I think we have an opportunity as schools to get over that a little bit. And this slide here, clear is kind. I think it is truly. We want to be kind. We want to be everyone to get along well. But really, the more honest that you can be, and the more clear that you can be about what's expected, and then how we're measuring against that expectation, then that truly is being professional and honestly being kind in helping that leader continue to develop. Because if you look at the flip side and you're not discussing expectations and you're not discussing ways that there's opportunities for improvement, you're really doing that leader a disservice, and allowing them to continue on in perhaps their misconceptions on what kind of job they're doing. So clear is kind is the message there, right? So we talked a little bit about the why of the evaluation process, but the how. How are we going to evaluate? How are we going to support? What kind of structures can we put in place to manage this entire process? So let's a little bit talk about the structure or the framework for supporting and evaluating your key leader, your chief executive, right? And again, a reminder to our board members that our job is to support and evaluate the head of school, but that's kind of where our evaluation expectation ends, right? That's the only employee of the school that we really evaluate. And that's the one employee of the board. The head of school and the leadership team of the school will be in charge of evaluating their own faculty and the staff. And so this is just the evaluation piece for the head of school, your one employee. So let's talk about how we set that up, right? Best practice suggests that you set up a subcommittee of the board to really put in place this evaluation process on behalf of the entire board. Now, it's important to notice here, Mary Catherine, that we're not talking about only a subsection of the board participating in the evaluation process, but they're the ones that set up the structure, right? And so I've seen this done two different ways, Mary Catherine. I've seen it done as a separate committee called the Head Support and Evaluation Committee or something along those lines. I've also visited a number of schools where they've done that with the Executive Committee. Have you seen other structures or do you have any thoughts around that, Mary Catherine?
Well, interestingly, we did it where the executive committee was the one who kind of did the evaluation and all of that. And I remember a couple of years ago when we were discussing this, one of the we were talking about this, and David Madison said, you know, one of the challenges with it being just the executive committee is that the executive committee isn't necessarily made up. It's made up of the people that fill the roles of the executive committee. And that doesn't necessarily make them automatically great at head support and evaluation. So, and I think he's right. It worked in my school for me to use the executive committee. It worked fine. But I do think that there's value in a separate committee where it's kind of hand-picked, where you are choosing people that would be really good at that job, just like we would do in a finance committee or another type of committee where there's kind of some specialized roles. So, I mean, I think you can easily do the executive committee. A lot of people do, but it feels like that maybe it's a little complex and may need to be a separate committee, but that's been my experience. It worked great for our school.
And I see that a lot, Mary Catherine, where the executive committee will assume the role. So depending on the size and the makeup, and honestly, the personalities of the members of your executive committee. And again, that's your president, vice president, treasurer, secretary, maybe the rector's involved as part of your executive committee as well. But that core group then very effectively can set up the structure and the expectations for the support and the evaluation process of the head of school. But if you decide you want to create a separate committee, really look for those members that can be fair and balanced in their work, that are really good about separating themselves from special interest or personal agendas. And we have a great webinar coming up this week, Mary Catherine, right, on the role of a board member who's also a parent in the community. and how to
Yes,
separate those.
few days, it's gonna be
We've got-
good.
We've got a great board chair of a school up in Amarillo, Texas, a fantastic school, St. Andrews. And this particular board chair is really good at understanding the role that she plays as a board member, but also as a parent, and how to separate those two. So, but you're going to want those kinds of personalities on that head support and evaluation committee, so that they can guard against personal agendas, they can respect confidentiality, and they can honor the boundaries that need to be honored in that evaluation process. So that's just a quick example of how to set up that committee, who is doing that work. So let's dig in a little bit deeper and talk about some other structure, right? And to begin with, trust is the foundation here across the board. And so it's imperative, I think, Mary Catherine, that whether it's a separate committee or the executive committee, there needs to be a level of trust, and the board needs to understand that their job is to develop and improve the leadership skills of their key leader. And the head of school has to trust and understand that the board has his or her best interests in mind, and that they will be the ones that will give them some direction on where to go and how to improve. And so trust is the key there throughout this process. So just quick, and just be honest, anybody here on this call, just put it in the chat. Does your school board currently use a separate head support and evaluation committee? I'm just curious.
You know, Rob, while they're putting that in the chat, I think it just kind of struck me that for me, the trust conversation begins with the board committee developing that trust. I think it's incumbent on the board to really develop that trust with the head of school and take the lead in that, because they're the head of school is the employee, right? And so I think if we're gonna come to the head support and evaluation committee as a head of school, and you want me to grow, growth means vulnerability. You don't grow unless you're vulnerable. And if you can't trust that committee, you're not going to be vulnerable and you're not going to grow. And so I think it's really incumbent upon the board chair and that committee to create a system of that's where they're holding that trust of the head of school really closely, and that they've developed that. I don't think it's necessarily going to be the head of school that starts that process, I guess is what I'm saying.
So we got a kind of a split, it looks like, in the chat. Some people using your executive committee, some folks are using the entire board, some folks are using a separate head support and evaluation committee. So depending on, again, the size of your board, that's an interesting way. I highly recommend, and we'll get into this presentation, that the entire board is active and participating in that evaluation and in that support piece. But as far as structuring how it's going to work, maybe that's the work of an individual committee. So excited to see that going on. I see some mention in the chat also that we have some schools with new heads coming on board. So not surprising. Some of the stats that we're seeing, approximately 23% of our schools in SAES, we have 102 schools across 6 states, and you know, in the span of a 2-year period, we're experiencing 23% turnover in our heads. And so and that's happening nationwide as well. I had a great conversation with David Madison. I'm actually in his office in Fort Worth, Texas at the moment. And he is they are experiencing that at the national level too. So tons of turnover in leadership, not surprising given how nuanced and complex the job of head of school is in today's political, cultural, economic climate.
Rob, can you repeat that stat for Andy?
Yeah, about 23% of our heads are turning over across the association over a 2-year period, right? That's a lot. Okay, so here's some steps for us to look in. And so the first kind of 5 steps as we're structuring this, so you've got your head support and evaluation committee or your executive committee. Their job is to guide this piece, right? Number 1 is to lock into a list of essential expectations, right? And these essential expectations are something that no matter who the head of school is, no matter who the chief executive is, these are expectations that the board has for their chief executive, and they're not going to change based on who's sitting in that chair. These are essential expectations and we'll go over an example list of those, but I would highly recommend that head support and evaluation committee use this sample list and build their own list of essential expectations, and then have a conversation with the full board about this is what, just beyond any particular goals for the year, these are just the most basic expectations that we have, right? And then step number two is that the head of school, and sometimes this can be a head of school exercise. What works really well is if it's a head of school exercise and maybe with the board chair together, or the head of school, the board chair, and the rector, depending on your organization, but drafts 2 or 3 major goals for the particular year, right? So I know that we're doing this webinar in January, but typically this is happening over the course of the summer prior to the launch of the school year, where the head of school can kind of evaluate together with the board chair and maybe taking the feedback from the previous evaluation and drafting 2 or 3 major goals for consideration. And you'll see that the word strategic plan is annotated here. That means those should tie to the strategic plan as much as possible. So 2 or 3 major goals, different from the list of essential expectations, right? So that's step number 2, 2 or 3 goals. And then during the summer, the head support and evaluation committee would review these essential goals that are drafted by the head of school, or together the head of school and the board chair would start reviewing and talking and having conversations about these 2 or 3 major goals. And then they would lock those into the evaluation instrument, and then they would finalize a draft of goals. And then finally, the next step 4 then would be to bring all that information from the head support and evaluation or executive committee to the full board, and to read those out and to have a conversation about those with the full board, right? So the full board then can formally adopt those goals, ideally at the first meeting of the board. If it's not at the first meeting, that doesn't mean you should necessarily wait and not have a conversation about goals until a year later, but as early in the school year as possible. And it's important that all the board be aware of what those goals are. And then step number 5, with respect to goal setting and support, would be that the head support and evaluation committee would meet periodically during the year, right? Maybe monthly or maybe quarterly, depending on what works for your organization. But then have conversations involving the head to kind of measure the progress or the work towards those adopted goals by the board, right? And sometimes that can be done as part of the monthly board meeting, where the head can give a little status update on work towards those individual goals, but it keeps everybody on the same page, right? So that's kind of the first 5 steps with respect to setting goals and setting up the structure for support. The takeaways there are locking into essential expectations and setting up those handful or less than a handful of goals. Mary Catherine, do you have any comments on why only 2 or 3 goals as opposed to 10 or 12 goals?
Well, I have personal experience at trying to accomplish 10 or 12 goals in a year. And quite frankly, it was a nightmare. The challenge is that really you want to have goals that you can actually achieve and get accomplished. And we're not talking about, there may be several things that a head of school accomplishes in a year that are more than just 2 or 3, right? We're not saying, oh, heads of schools should only do a couple of things a year. What we're saying is that you've got a whole list of essential expectations that you're also trying to meet as well. And the head of schools, the goals really should be tied to the strategic plan. That way you're not trying to evaluate based on personality. We're not evaluating on personality or popularity. We're evaluating on, here are the goals we set for you, and did you achieve them? And and it's pretty black and white. And so 2 or 3 is really probably the best that it could be realistically expected, I think.
The other key reason, Mary Catherine, you're 100% correct on that. The other key thing too is that it's important to have this conversation with the full board, and the full board then come to an agreement and officially adopt these goals, because at the end of the cycle, these are the goals that the head should be evaluated against, right? We see that happens in a lot of schools that don't follow a similar process, is that every board member has their own personal set of goals and expectations for the head of school. And now all of a sudden we've got 5 or 6 goals times 10 board members, 56 things that, maybe there's some crossover among some of the board members, but it becomes an impossible task for the head of school. And we're really setting that head of school up for failure when there's not a documented and communicated set of goals and ideas that we're evaluating the head of school against. But we'll get into some more of that detail here in just one second. So, all right, steps 6 through 9 in the evaluation and review process. Again, I can't emphasize this enough. The full board participation in the actual evaluation process itself is super, super important, right? Again, usually this happens in late spring. So you've set up your essential expectations. The head of school is aware of that. The head of school has helped drafted with the board chair what some 2 or 3 goals are. Those were adopted by the full board. Now, fast forward, there's been work in progress towards these goals all throughout the year. And then later in the spring, the full board begins to participate by responding to an evaluation instrument, which collects data about not only the essential expectations, which don't change year after year, or maybe only slightly, but also progress on those particular goals, right? And again, this is an interesting and somewhat controversial bullet point here, number 2 under step 6, but this is a board function. And I would encourage you to resist the temptation to pass that obligation on to the faculty and the staff and the parents. A lot of folks think about maybe a 360 review, but again, those people have their own agendas and their own ideas and their own set of expectations. And with respect to essential expectations, you can get some good data by consulting and doing some surveying and whatnot, but the evaluation piece of the instrument, and particularly evaluating against progress towards those goals, the faculty and the staff or the parents aren't going to have a full understanding of what those goals are and the work that's needed toward them. Then they're going to be, clouded by their own particular set of expectations for the head of school, and then it becomes kind of an unfair process. I'm not suggesting that we don't survey parents and faculty and staff, and that kind of feedback can't provide very valuable information to the head of school, but particularly early on, before that trust across the entire community is fully developed, I think you got to be very leery about gathering that information. And I absolutely wouldn't include that as part of the evaluation process. Maybe some feedback process for the board or for the head of school, but asking, faculty and staff who don't have a full understanding of all the finances and all the strategic planning, maybe that's going on in the background and expectations of the board, to evaluate the head of school, I think can be problematic. And I think that's the job of the board, not the job of the faculty and staff, or not the job of the parents. So again, any thoughts or questions on that, Mary Catherine, for you?
Rob, one thing that I would also say is that this comes up a lot. Does this mean that if there seems to be an issue between the faculty and the head of school, and the board knows that, how do we address that? And for me, if we want to know how we're doing as leaders, we definitely need to be asking feedback of the faculty, but that feedback ask should come from the head of school. And the board, if the head of school is not willing to do that, then the board then has the ability to say to the head of school, hey, you need to be checking in with your faculty to make sure that if they're, that's just good leadership to find out, what does my leadership look like to you, and what are the things that you feel like you need support from me? Should that come from the board directly to the faculty and step over the head of school? In my opinion, no, because there's not a connection, remember, in good governance between the board and the faculty. but there is a connection between the board and the head of school. And I think there is something incumbent upon the board to make sure that the head of school is asking those questions around the leadership. And often that's where we get into trouble, is that faculty is frustrated by the head of school on something and the board's hearing about it. And so rather than us doing it through the head support and evaluation committee, the board goes, well, we'll just do a survey of the faculty to find out what's going on. And to me, that's not how we should do it. It would be better to go into the head support and evaluation committee and go, hey, we're hearing some things that are concerning to us. And we're hearing it kind of through the grapevine, which is usually how you hear it, and get the head of school's take. And then let the head of school go, hey, gosh, I need it. And I'll just give you an anecdote that happened to me when I was doing a capital campaign. I was super busy in a capital campaign, and the faculty felt kind of left out and ignored by me, that justifiably so. And I got some heads up from my head support and evaluation committee. And guess what I did? I did a little survey, and guess what? They were kind of frustrated with me. So I had to do something about that. But it was me doing something about it. And it was me garnering that information. The board didn't go, hey, we're hearing, we need to find this out, so we're going to go do a survey. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
It does. And I think, Mary Catherine, I'm glad you shared that particular example, because that's a great example of the board saying, here, one of your goals this year is to really knock it out of the park on this capital campaign. And it's going to take a ton of your time and energy. Now, faculty and staff members aren't going to see all the behind the scenes work that goes into, raising that kind of money to do a major capital campaign. And they're going to obviously feel a little left out and neglected, perhaps, especially if that's been a strength of yours in the past. But the board is asking you to do something and turn your attention a different way. They've got a goal for you set up, and then to go back to the faculty then to say, hey, how is she doing?
Yeah.
That just seems a little backwards to me. The other challenge is that ultimately, the head of school evaluates and ultimately is the one who hires and fires those faculty and staff. And to set up a dynamic where the faculty then report to the board is not good governance, right? The faculty and staff need to report to and be held accountable by the head of school, and the head of school then reports to and is held accountable by the board. And I think if you start, allowing faculty or families to perform that evaluation function, then that can get you in trouble in a hurry. Anyway, that's kind of my 2 cents. But again, what I'm not saying is that feedback through surveys and conversations with families and with faculty and staff members is essentially important, but that's not the evaluation. That's all I'm saying. All right, so that's step number 6. Step number 7. So you've got this data, you've got this instrument, and you've evaluated then, and every board member is then participating and bringing to bear his or her thoughts and opinions with respect to essential expectations and with respect to the progress on established goals. You've got all this data. Now the head support and evaluation committee or the executive committee, their job is to review that raw data with the head of school, right? And again, this is super important. Clear is kind. Don't beat around the bush. Here's the data that came across, and here's the raw data. And let's talk a little bit about what that is. That conversation happens at that committee level with the head of school to begin with, and then some summary documents. And so maybe the board chair or maybe the chair of the head and support evaluation committee would prepare some summary documents, and then this presentation then would be made at a full board meeting that says, here's how the head of school is doing with respect to these essential expectations, and then here's how they're doing on with respect to progress towards individual goals, right? Step 8 then is to schedule that executive session to review with the head of school. I think I jumped ahead on this a little bit already, but again, this is the time that the executive session should take place without the head of school present, right? So there is an executive session, and then the head of school then is invited in to discuss kind of where we end up with that evaluation piece, right? And then again, we're going to repeat the process in step 9. We're going to look at the instrument. Did it serve our purposes? Do we need to get a different instrument? Do we need to tweak this instrument? And did the goals serve the strategic plan and the mission of the school, right? So there's our 6 steps of the evaluation process, which in and of itself provides support to the head of school. I'm curious, Mary Catherine, there's something that's dawning on me that's missing out of this process. I'm curious if you and I are thinking the same thing right here. Any idea anything jump out to you as missing? You got the evaluation of the head, but maybe that's not the end of the game. I wonder if there's
Well,
we need
are
to
you thinking
evaluate.
about board evaluation?
Exactly.
There
Board
you go. Look,
evaluation.
I got it. I was getting nervous.
Putting Mary Catherine on the spot, right? So it's easy for the board to evaluate their chief executive. Well, it seems like it would be, although many schools don't do it, unfortunately. It's something, it's a practice that you've got to put in place. But the other piece of that is taking an honest account and evaluation of your own work as a board. So not only do you want to evaluate, ask our board members to evaluate the head of school against essential expectations and progress towards communicated goals, but we also want the board to reflect on their own participation as a board member and to perform a self-evaluation on the work of the board, both their work as an individual board member and the work of the board as a whole. And did we remain true to our governance expectations? Did we work towards individual goals, with respect to finances and with respect to marketing or whatever the key areas for your particular school may be? But I think that's critical, a piece of the puzzle. It's not part of this presentation, but I wanted to mention that because so many of you, as you have established this process, really need to include that process as well. So any other thoughts on that, Mary Catherine?
No, I think it's really important. And I think it happens often that we may be quick to evaluate the head of school, but not so much ourselves, which I guess is human nature, but.
Yeah. So let's dig into some of these examples of what the essential expectations may be, right? Essential expectations for the head of school. These were pulled from a group called the Independent School Management and a publication they have called Ideas and Perspectives back from 2019. You probably have some of these listed under the heading of expectations for faculty and staff, published in your faculty and staff handbook as an example. But these are just, kind of foundational expectations for the head of school year after year, right? Kind of no-brainers, right? Is the head of school working to advance the school's strategic plan at the operational level, right? Is the head of schools supporting and acting within the school's mission and values? Is the school upholding the head of school upholding professional standards with respect to presentation, punctuality, courtesy, discretion, right? Those are just essential expectations. Is the head of school representing the school effectively to its constituents? And that may include current families, future families, past families, alumni families, faculty, staff, church members, all across the board. Is the head of school developing and effectively evaluating the personnel? This is an essential expectation. Is that happening, right? And again, I'll warn you that in some instances, that's the work of the head of school. In some instances, that's the work of maybe a division director under the guidance of the head of school. But regardless, that faculty and staff evaluation needs to be happening as well. Does the head of school represent the school by maintaining a professional demeanor on and off campus, right? I know sometimes I got a little animated at a sporting contest or so, but if it goes over or out of bounds and I get a little carried away, then, I should be called out on that as a head of school. Just as an example. There's some other ones, sorry, clicking too fast. Does your head of school maintain professional credentials? Is there a growth plan? Is the head of school, are he or she attending professional development opportunities and continuing to improve, right? Is the head of school honoring the confidentiality of the schools, of the students, of the employee information that's out there? Is the head of school complying with all policies and procedures of the school? as well as all the legal expectations with respect to operating the school, the HR expectations at a state and federal level, as an example, or the reporting procedures, those kinds of things. Is the head of school working effectively? Is he communicating? Is she communicating with the Board of Trustees effectively? Is the head of school making satisfactory progress on an annual basis towards these key objectives as developed? And again, that's the goal pieces, right? Is there progress? Is there work? And again, by the end of a year, a stated goal at the beginning of the year may have adjusted, may have changed, may have undergone some revision. I think that's perfectly fine. But again, is there a conversation? Is there work towards? Is there progress that you can document towards those goals that were articulated at the start of the year? Those are your essential expectations. Mary Catherine, anything we're missing there?
No, I don't think so. I think that I think this is the section where you're able to, if you've got particular issues around, you may have a head of school that's really great at achieving strategic initiatives, but is late every day, or is great at a lot of things, but maybe isn't connecting with the faculty like you want them to connect. So this is an area where you can kind of gather those kind of gray things inside these essential expectations, because even if they're not meeting, there are a couple of times they're not meeting these things, but they are doing the strategic plan initiatives. This is where you do it. And this feels to me a lot of times where the gray can be captured, and you can have conversations about the gray things that maybe are harder to capture. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And so if you perceive that there's maybe a disconnect between your head of school and the faculty, or a lack of trust or a lack of support, again, that's where you can start documenting some of that kind of thing, or some of that can be reflected in the evaluation instrument. And I want to point out that once you develop your list of essential expectations for your head of school, the head of school is aware of these. They know these. They give us an opportunity to talk about particular strengths or particular weaknesses of the head of school. But my suggestion to you is, as you develop an instrument to measure or capture some sort of scoring system on this, is that does the head of school maintain professional credentials and demonstrate a passion for continued learning and growth and development? You're going to rate the head of school's performance not as a yes or a no, but on some sort of a scale, right? So one being failing miserably, not meeting expectations, all the way up to 5 to exceeding expectations, or however kind of scale works for you. And if you set that up in a Google survey type instrument, or SurveyMonkey, or whatever your survey tool of choice is, then that data can be crunched then by that survey tool, and you can have a real clear picture of some general analysis, some consensus of the group with respect to these essential expectations. And then immediately the head of school and the committee can see areas of strength and areas of weakness for that particular head. All right, so let's dig into goal setting just a little bit, right? Because again, how we set those goals up is going to be really important. Again, at the beginning of the year, and again, this is a great time for the head to sit down and to, again, review the current strategic plan with the board chair, with the head support and evaluation committee, perhaps, and to sit down and say, okay, where are we? What progress have we made? And given the current state of affairs with respect to our school, maybe where enrollment is, maybe where finances are, whatever the case may be, what are some key objectives related to our strategic plan that'll be developed into goals for this particular year? Now, some of you may be between strategic plans, or maybe you've really got to get to work on a formal strategic planning document, which Mary Catherine and I can help you with if you're interested, or we can recommend other people. But you don't have that strategic plan to refer to, then maybe just do a quick and dirty SWOT analysis, right? Where again, you just evaluate very quickly, here's our strengths, here's our weaknesses, here's our opportunities, here's our threats. and develop some goals based on that would address, how do we preserve our strengths? How do we address our weaknesses? How do we take advantage of certain opportunities? And how do we mitigate certain threats within our organization? And that can help you develop some of those key goals as well. Again, so from that list, I would highly encourage you to try to, some people say 5, some people say 3, some people say 2, but I would say a reasonable short list of goals of things that you really want the board, the head of school rather, to focus on. And again, that'll be part of the board's evaluation of itself as well, is evaluating ourselves on how did we assist the school in reaching these particular goals, right? And so if you get too long of a list or it's too varied, then the time and attention of the head of school, who's incredibly stretched then by the day-to-day operational and management aspects of the school, will have a very hard time focusing on any core group of those goals. So really try to keep that list pretty short and to the point, right? Again, tie it to the strategic plan, and each objective, again, this is a kind of an interesting point. Each objective should be a potential institutional difference maker, right? So again, that's going to help you to think big on these goals as opposed to get the parking lot restriped, right? I mean, clearly the head of school is going to get that done, but that might fit under a larger goal of improve the overall look and feel of facilities across the board, to increase visitor or potential applicants in the enrollment process, right? Something like that. And that might be one example of how they address it. So, larger institutional difference maker level goals. Mary Catherine, anything to add there?
No, I think that particular statement would help if you've got too many objectives, then, and you can't decide which ones to do. I think what you can do is go, okay, let's look at this list of 10 and go, which ones are actual institutional difference makers? Because often we look back at it from that lens and we go, oh, that one's not as important as this one. It helps, I think, determine what the most important priorities are.
Absolutely. Great input. All right. Some follow-up thoughts on the goal setting, right? Again, sometimes boards attempt to identify every activity and behavior they expect of the head of school and document that as a goal. Again, it's going to create a giant list of things, but it doesn't allow you to isolate kind of the key results that you want the board to focus on, right? And again, we talked a little bit about earlier, or one of the bullet points earlier was with respect to vital signs of a healthy school that we look for at SAES when we come in and we do accreditation or we do consultations. And one of the things that we look at is that the vital sign of a healthy, well-positioned school is whether or not the board has a fair and constructive process for the ongoing evaluation of the head of school and the board itself. So it did get included in this presentation. I'm glad. The process clearly outlines the roles, responsibilities, basic expectations, essential expectations. And without this, the clarity for both the board and the head could interfere with each other's effectiveness, right? So again, understanding the roles and responsibilities of the board versus the head, and then having a clear set of expectations for the head, as well as a handful of goals that are established and agreed upon with significant input from the head, but also all the input for the entire board, and then measuring progress against that is kind of the key takeaway and the vital sign that we want to see here at SAES. So I know we're kind of getting towards the end. We talked about strategies and goals a little bit. So let's talk a little bit about the support piece for a second, Mary Catherine. That's the evaluation piece. And I can, if we have time at the end, I can show you some examples of, setting up an instrument that you can use for that goal, and how you can plug that into that instrument to create a survey with Google Surveys or SurveyMonkey. But let's talk about supporting the head of school as well, right? And so this is really, really key, is heads more than ever with all this turnover. We know They're stretched, thinner than they've ever been stretched before. The job is incredibly nuanced and complex, and the level of stress and anxiety among our leaders, they need this support more than ever before, right? Again, as the head support and evaluation committee, your job is to find a way to advocate for the entire school community or the entire church and school community, as it may be, right? Not just a limited segment of that particular community, right? So as you support, again, you've got to be an advocate for the whole community, not just for the athletics, because that's what your kids are involved in, or the fine arts, because that's what your kids are involved in, or the third grade, because your kid's in third grade, right? You've got to be able to see the big picture and advocate for the entire community, right? You've got to be very careful to never speak publicly in a derogatory manner about the school or the leadership. And that's true, not just of the head support and evaluation committee, but of the entire board. Now, when you get into a board meeting, if there's things that you're frustrated about, absolutely have those conversations. Or if you can go to your board chair and discuss things that are on your heart about that. Or if you need to go directly to the head of school and express your thoughts and opinions from a board member's perspective, I think that's going to be really important. But again, from a public facing standpoint, you've got to really hold the line. That's super important. And that can be a huge support for the head of school. And I can think of times where there's been, I know board members of mine that may have been frustrated about something or other that have happened in the school, but they were able to act very professionally. And that was a huge support to me, even though they maybe not necessarily 100% agreed with the decision I made as a head of school. But that's critically important. Again, avoiding getting dragged into, I don't think any board members necessarily come into it intending to interfere with the day-to-day operations of the school. At least I hope not. But sometimes you kind of get dragged in, right? You've got friends and they call you and they say, hey, can you believe this? Or I can't believe this is happening. And they try to drag you in. And I think you've got to really, to show support for the head of school, you've got to really intentionally find ways to not interfere in the day-to-day operations of the school. That's super important. And then it may just kind of seem trite, but it's super important, is, pray for the head of school. And I've had board members that not only would pray for me, but would also tell me, hey, just thinking about you today and saying some prayers for you in this regard. I know this is really hard, but I've got your back, or I trust you, or I'm praying for you with respect to this particular item. I can't tell you how much strength as a head of school that I got from my board members, which were fantastic, that reached out and were always willing to communicate. And I know that they didn't always 100% of the time agree with me or support a decision I made or an action that I took. But I knew that I could trust them and that they had my back ultimately, right? And they were able to communicate that. This is a huge one. As a head support and evaluation committee, you've got to be the one sometimes, because no one else will. The word we have on the bullet point is encourage the head of school, but you literally have to say, turn your phone off, go be with your family. I don't want you checking in over the Christmas holiday. If it's an emergency, we'll get a hold of you, but you've got to disconnect and you've got to really recharge those batteries, right? I can't tell you how important that is. And sometimes that's one of the most important things the head support and evaluation committee can do, is to keep a close eye on the head of school, because lots of times heads of schools become workaholics and they are passionate and they love their community like crazy, but they're not able to see that they're not taking care of themselves spiritually, emotionally, mentally, or physically. And that self-care piece is vitally important. And I think some of the worst decisions or mistakes that I made as a head of school were because I pushed myself too far and I got a little too tired, a little too exhausted, or tried to act too quickly because I was in a place where I wasn't as healthy as I needed to be emotionally or mentally or spiritually. And that's when mistakes are made. So it's good for your school. It's good for the head of school. And I think you've really got to take a proactive measure. And I don't know that encourage is a strong enough word there. Mary Catherine, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, that last bullet point about remembering what a lonely job it is, the reality is that when you're the head, there's nobody really above you to say, take a day off. And the people below you tell you to take the day off, but they don't really mean it. I mean, they just don't. Because that's just the price of leadership to a large extent. And so this idea that there's a board chair or a head support and evaluation committee that will say, hey, we expect you not to show up for 2 weeks, and we're going to check in to make sure you don't. That gives the head the kind of, whew, I can do it. I can actually take 2 weeks off or whatever. And it's critically important. And I love what you said, Rob, about if your head of school is not healthy, they are not going to make good decisions. And if they don't make good decisions, the school's affected. So practically speaking, it's for the benefit of the whole community for the head to not be exhausted emotionally and physically and spiritually. So well said.
The other way you could encourage your head of school to use their time effectively is to be really engaged in professional learning opportunities, to engage with other heads at workshops and conferences. It's critically important to kind of get out of the forest that surrounds you so you can kind of step back and take a look around and learn. And it is a lonely job. And so really being encouraging and supportive of professional development for your head of school, whether they're there for the first year or they've been there 20 years, is critically important. And I see some schools kind of get a little twisted, a little sideways, where why is the head of school going to this conference? You know, it's yes, there's important work to do, but it's professional learning for that head that'll keep them healthy and whole and thinking in the right frame of mind. So I think that's time and energy well spent.
Yeah.
All right. So I'm wondering what thoughts or questions. We've got maybe 3 or 4 minutes left. If you have a thought or question, you know, what did I miss? And then I want to pull up an example of maybe what a evaluation instrument might look like. Is that cool? So put your thoughts and questions, if you have any, in the chat, and just give me a second here if I see if I can find that document for you.
You know, it's a lot of information. We've given you a lot of information. We are going to give you, as a participant, you'll receive a copy of the slide deck, but just know that we are happy to, you can email us or whatever if you have additional questions that you think about later. Okay, Sarah, what if we are an interim head of school situation? Can we still put together goals for the year? Absolutely. Probably should have some, they'd be different, Rob, than a permanent head, but the interim often has particular goals that they're trying to reach. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the context, obviously, of an interim head is going to be a little bit different. So your goals may be, a little more modest with respect to growth or development, but more focused on the culture and the community, maintaining or words like that, or supporting the faculty and staff, right, who may be really stressed in an interim situation, or, developing, a strong working relationship with the constituents or the partnership with the church, for example, or, depending on the situation, some interims are hired to come in and clean house, right? And so, identify, core faculty members and help press the reset button for the next head of school, things like that, right? So depending on where you are and what the needs are, some interim situations require just that calming pastoral presence. Some require, that some really difficult decisions and be made and some restructuring happen. So depending on where you are, I think that can help guide. But absolutely, 100% interims need goals as well. They're just going to look different. All right, let me share this last little piece with you. I can't find where I put the survey version of it, but here it is in Word version, if you guys can see that. Can you see that okay, Mary Catherine? So again, so what you would do is you would take this document and you would plug this questions into a survey instrument and allow your board members to respond to each of these prompts on a scale. This particular scale says A, B, C, D, kind of a grading scale, A through F. I like kind of the 1 through 5 because you can use that numerical data to average out numbers and rankings and scores a little bit better than you can with A, B, C, D, F. But however you like to do it, right? Set that up. And then again, so each person then will say, okay, how did the head of school do representing and carrying out the school's mission and philosophy? Well, I would give Rob a 4, I would give Rob a 2, I would give Rob a 4, I would give Rob a 2, a 2, a 2, right? Those can all be then averaged out. We can have a nice graph that's published. The survey tools will do that for you. And then we can have that conversation. Hey, you scored an average of a 3.3 with respect to carrying out the mission, and then have a conversation about that. The same thing with communicating that mission or living that mission, communicating the board to the board, the head's activities. Does the head do a good job of communicating what he or she is doing on a daily or weekly or monthly basis with the board so that they're aware of initiatives happening within the school with respect to the math curriculum or the science curriculum, or what kind of testing instrument are we doing, those kinds of things, right? And then for each of these, I would recommend that you have some sort of comment section built in so that the respondent can then say, look, I gave Rob a 4 on this, and here's why they didn't get a 5, if there's some additional information that needs to happen, right? So any kind of open-ended information lots of times can help and be very helpful for the head of school if they're genuinely interested in improving his or her performance, right? So you have whatever your essential expectations are built in, and those become prompts for individual ranking questions. And then you'll see with respect to goal number 1, with respect to goal number 2, with respect to goal number 3, and then the goal itself is stated. And these are lifted from the meeting notes from the start of the year when the board agreed on what those goals are, right? So if the goal was the head in the coming school year will develop a comprehensive enrollment management plan to address shortfalls in enrollment in the 4- and 5-year-old program, that might be a goal, right? And then we're able to then rate the performance against the goal of the work that the head has done on that. But it's not a surprise at that point, right? Everyone's not surprised to say, oh, why are we about that? Was something that we've talked about, we've communicated. It's a high level goal that we're going to work on this particular year. So anyway, I've gone over time. I apologize. Any last minute thoughts and questions?
Hey, Rob, we have one question, and I'm going to stop the recording because I think this is a good one, and then we'll stop it later.
Sure.
And it's Charles Key. I'm curious about step 8 on the evaluation process in regards to the full board being involved in the face-to-face evaluation of the head of school. Will this not introduce personal agendas of some parents that are board members? That step, Rob, correct me if I'm wrong, is not. It's your response. You're giving the evaluation. You're finished with it, and so you're just reporting out. As opposed, you're reporting the results in that step. Does that make sense, Charles?
Yes. Thank you. That clarifies it. I was, like I say, I was a little confused. We spent so much time, being very careful who was on the committee,
right?
And then, to make sure that there's no biases. So thank you for clarifying that.
Great question. Okay.
Yeah, I think you want to be as transparent as possible with the full board, so that everyone knows, okay, here's the results of what everyone thought. And this can help us inform our next set of goals, perhaps, right? But
and remember that the survey that you're doing prior to the evaluation is based on the goals that were set. So that also eliminates the ability for board members to go in and talk about their personal agendas, because we're asking board members to give feedback on the goals that we agreed on. So you could give feedback, I guess, you can try to give feedback on the head's personality or the way they dress, but that's not a goal. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about the goals that we agreed on. And that also eliminates that personal agenda, I think. Right?
Okay. Thank you for clarifying that.
Okay.
So last point of that, it also illuminates everyone's comments for the rest of the group. So even though they might not be tied to an individual board member, because you're being transparent and discussing all the input from that particular evaluation instrument, then clearly a skilled chair of the head support and evaluation committee, when presenting these results to the full board, can easily help guide the conversation in areas that are constructive versus not as constructive, and may contain some personal agendas. And that becomes very obvious to the entire board at that point, because all of that is illuminated and offered in a transparent manner. So anyway, just a thought on that, but I think that's a great point, Charles. May Catherine wrap us up.
Yeah, well,
If I could just have one more question real quick.
Sure.
Yep.
Is there a recommended form? I noticed you showed an idea about a form, but does the SAES have a best practices form as far as evaluation, or do you leave it up to each school to come up with their own form?
So each school typically makes its own form, but I can send out a sample, and I can send out this sample as an example, right? So this is a sample from a school. I can send out another sample that I'm aware of, and you can use that as the building block to build your own.
That would be helpful. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. Well, listen, I'm going to say, first of all, this is a great conversation and great questions. I think it's such an important topic, and we thank all of you who came live, and we thank all of you, those of you who are watching this on the recording. We're going to stop the recording and it will be available in a couple of days through SAES. So thanks, y'all, and have a great day.
Thanks, everybody. Happy